history of the Italian Mafia does not begin with blood oaths swore in dimly lit rooms, nor does it begin with men in sharp-tailored suits. It begins in the dust. It begins in the sun-bleached, rocky hills of 19th-century Sicily, an island in the Mediterranean that had been conquered, plundered, and abandoned by almost every major empire in human history. For centuries, the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, the Spanish, and the French Bourbons ruled over Sicily. To these foreign courts, the island was never a place to build a society. It was an extraction colony, a place to harvest grain, sulfur, and taxes. Because of this endless cycle of foreign occupation, the Sicilian people developed a deep, cultural, and generational psychological armor. The state was not a protector. The law was not a shield. The government was an invading army that came to steal your sons for their military conscription and take your crops to pay for distant palaces. To survive, you relied only on the bloodline. You relied on the family. To trust an outsider, to trust a judge or a policeman, was not just foolish. It was seen as a profound betrayal of your own people. By the early 1800s, the land of Sicily was divided into massive agricultural estates called latifundia. These sprawling territories were owned by wealthy European barons who lived luxuriously in Palermo or Naples, completely insulated from the brutal reality of rural life. The barons needed someone to manage their lands and squeeze profits out of the illiterate peasantry. They hired intermediaries known as gabellotti. The gabellotto was a ruthless character. He was an estate manager, a tax collector, and a judge all rolled into one. He leased the land from the distant baron for a fixed fee, and any profit he could wring out of the peasants above that fee was his to keep. To enforce his will, to prevent peasant uprisings, and to protect the livestock from bandits, the gabellotto hired private, armed militias. These men were known as campieri or bravi. They were skilled marksmen, they rode horses, they carried shotguns, and they possessed an absolute monopoly on violence in the rural interior. They did not answer to the law, they answered to the man who paid them. These armed enforcers were the literal, direct ancestors of the mafia soldier. Then came the year 1861, a turning point that was supposed to change everything, but instead broke the island completely. The revolutionary leader Giuseppe Garibaldi marched through the south, overthrowing the Bourbon kings and unifying Italy under a single northern monarch. The Sicilian peasants genuinely believed that unification would bring land reform, that the massive estates would be broken up, and that they would finally own the soil they bled over. Instead, the new Italian government based in Rome proved to be even more predatory than the kings before them. They imposed crushing new taxes on everyday essentials like flour and salt. They made military service mandatory, dragging young men away from family farms for years at a time. When the Sicilians resisted, Rome responded with absolute brutality. They declared martial law, suspended civil liberties, and sent tens of thousands of northern Italian soldiers to occupy the island. In this chaotic vacuum, the new Italian state had no legitimacy. If a man's livestock was stolen, if his daughter was insulted, or if a boundary line was crossed, he could not go to the authorities. To do so was to invite a foreign army into your village. A new system of private justice was needed, and the campieri and gabellotti were ready to sell it. Violence became a commodity, bought and sold to the highest bidder to maintain order where the state could not. While the rural interior of Sicily was trapped in a cycle of feudal poverty, a massive economic boom was quietly transforming the northern coast, specifically the fertile plains surrounding the city of Palermo, known as the Conca d'Oro, the Golden Shell. This boom was not driven by gold or silver, but by the humble lemon. In the late 1700s, the British Royal Navy made a medical breakthrough that altered global trade forever. They discovered that consuming citrus fruits entirely prevented scurvy, the devastating disease that had slaughtered sailors on long sea voyages for centuries. Suddenly, lemons shifted from a localized luxury into an essential high-value global commodity. Every navy, merchant fleet, and shipping line in the world needed millions of gallons of lemon juice. Because of its perfect Mediterranean climate and rich volcanic soil, Sicily became the primary citrus supplier to the entire world. By the 1860s, cultivating a lemon grove in the Conca d'Oro was incredibly lucrative. The profits per acre far outstripped traditional wheat farming, attracting massive amounts of investment capital. But citrus cultivation possessed a set of unique, highly fragile structural vulnerabilities that made it the absolute perfect breeding ground for organized extortion. First, a lemon tree is a long-term investment. It takes between 5 to 7 years of meticulous care, watering, and pruning before a tree bears a single piece of marketable fruit. If those trees are destroyed, a decade of capital vanishes instantly. Second, citrus groves require an immense, constant supply of water. In the dry Sicilian summers, an orchard must be irrigated every few days. This meant a complex network of wells, pipes, aqueducts, and locks had to be constructed across intersecting properties. These factors created a predator's paradise. The armed enforcers, who had sharpened their teeth on the inland feudal estates, migrated to the coastal citrus groves. They realized they no longer needed to work for a wage. They could use the threat of violence to extract wealth from the independent orchard owners. The mechanism was elegantly terrifying. An armed man would approach a wealthy lemon grower and offer an ultimatum. Hire me as your warden, pay me a regular fee, and use my preferred transport companies, or I cannot guarantee the safety of your investment. If the owner refused, the consequences were swift and catastrophic. A rival could slip into the grove overnight and poison the main water well. They could chop through the irrigation pipes or systematically hack down the trunks of hundreds of young trees, bankrupting the owner before the sun came up. If the owner paid the fee, however, his trees remained untouched, his water flowed abundantly, and his competitors suddenly found themselves facing mysterious acts of arson. This was the birth of the pizzo, the protection racket. The extortionists quickly realized that by controlling the water sources and the transport routes from the orchards to the bustling docks of Palermo, they held the entire international citrus industry by the throat. They dictated who could buy water, which laborers were allowed to pick the fruit, and which brokers were permitted to sell it to British and American merchants. They were no longer mere bandits, they were the regulators of the market. For decades, the official stance of the royal government in Rome was one of denial. They dismissed the rising tide of violence in Sicily as the work of isolated, unorganized rural highwaymen, primitive bandits who hid in caves and robbed travelers. They refused to acknowledge that a sophisticated, invisible system of governance was taking root. That illusion was shattered by two historic events at the turn of the century. The first real-world look inside this criminal ecosystem occurred in 1872 with the case of Dr. Gaspare Galati, a highly respected surgeon from Palermo. Dr. Galati inherited a magnificent, high-yielding lemon grove in the Malaspina district just outside the city. The estate came with a long-term manager named Benedetto Carolo. Dr. Galati, an educated man who believed in the rule of law, quickly noticed that the estate was bleeding money despite high production. Carolo was systematically skimming the profits, falsifying shipping manifests, and intentionally manufacturing financial losses so that he could eventually force Galati to sell the land to him at a fraction of its value. Dr. Galati fired Carolo and hired a new, honest warden. Within days of taking the job, the new warden was ambushed inside the lemon grove, shot in the back, and killed in broad daylight. When Galati went to the local police to report the murder and name Carolo as the mastermind, he encountered a wall of bureaucratic indifference. The police inspector delayed the paperwork, lost the evidence, and actively protected Carolo. It turned out the inspector and his superiors were receiving regular monthly payouts from Carolo's crew. Defiant, Galati hired a second warden. He too was shot and wounded. After receiving a series of highly detailed letters outlining how his wife and children would be butchered if he did not reinstate Carolo, Dr. Galati realized the Italian state was completely powerless to protect him. He abandoned his property, packed his bags in the dead of night, and fled across the sea to Naples. 26 years later, in 1898, a man named Ermanno Sangiorgi was appointed as the chief of police of Palermo. Sangiorgi was different from his predecessors. He was an incorruptible, deeply analytical investigator who refused to take bribes. He spent 2 solid years conducting the first systemic, forensic mapping of organized crime in human history. In February 1900, Sangiorgi delivered an explosive 485-page masterwork to the Ministry of the Interior. This document, known to history as the Sangiorgi Report, demolished the myth of the isolated bandit. Sangiorgi proved with absolute mathematical clarity that the mafia was a single, highly structured, unified criminal network. He mapped out 8 distinct mafia clans operating in the immediate suburbs of Palermo, meticulously documenting their hierarchies, their safe houses, and their exact methods. He discovered that they possessed a formal initiation ritual involving blood and fire, a shared legal defense fund to pay for the lawyers of arrested members, and an interprovincial council of bosses who met regularly to arbitrate territorial disputes and authorize executions. Armed with this report, Sangiorgi launched a massive, coordinated midnight raid, arresting over 60 top-tier mafiosi in a single night. But when the cases finally made it to court, the true power of the organization revealed itself. The mafia's political infrastructure went to work. One by one, the star witnesses who had given detailed statements to Sangiorgi suffered sudden, total amnesia on the witness stand, terrified of the inevitable retaliation. Wealthy, high-ranking landlords and politicians stepped into the courtroom to provide glowing character references for the accused bosses, swearing they were honorable men of charity. The majority of the mafiosi were acquitted and walked out of the courtroom laughing. Sangiorgi's career was quietly ruined. He was stripped of his command and reassigned to a minor post, and his historic report was buried deep inside government archives, not to see the light of day for nearly 90 years. To truly understand how these early mafiosi operated, you must understand the rigid, insular cultural codes that governed their day-to-day lives. They did not view themselves as criminals or outlaws. In their own minds, they were men of traditional values, upholding an ancient system of honor in a world corrupted by modern politics. The bedrock of this entire criminal architecture was Omerta. While modern pop culture often reduces Omerta to a simple code of silence among gangsters, its original historical meaning in Sicily was far broader and deeper. It was an all-encompassing philosophy of radical self-reliance and absolute anti-state defiance. An honorable man did not appeal to a court of law to solve his grievances, because to do so was an admission of weakness, a confession that he could not protect his own household. If a man's brother was murdered, he did not call the police. He initiated a vendetta, a blood feud. Omerta dictated that even if you were lying in the dirt, bleeding to death from a gunshot wound, and the police asked you who shot you, your absolute duty was to look them in the eye and say, "I don't know." To speak to a representative of the law was to forfeit your humanity. There was an old, chilling Sicilian proverb passed down through families that defined the era. He who is deaf, blind, and silent will live 100 years in peace. The organization itself was called Cosa Nostra, which translates literally to our thing. It was designed as an artificial family that took precedence over all biological ties, all religious obligations, and all allegiance to the country. To enter this family, a recruit had to undergo a sacred, pseudo-religious baptism of blood. The initiation took place in a secluded room, away from the eyes of the public and the law. The recruit was brought before the family boss and the senior members of the clan. A senior soldier would take a needle or a knife and prick the trigger finger of the recruit until the blood flowed freely. This blood was then smeared directly onto a paper holy card, typically bearing the image of the Virgin Mary or Saint Michael the Archangel. The paper card was placed into the open palms of the recruit, and the boss would strike a match, setting the holy image on fire. As the flames licked his skin, the recruit was forced to pass the burning paper from hand to hand to keep from being scorched, all while looking the boss in the eye and reciting a binding oath. "May my flesh burn like this saint if I betray the secrets of the family." From that exact second, the recruit was no longer an ordinary citizen. He was a made man, a man of honor. He was granted a license to kill on behalf of the family, and he entered a highly structured, militaristic hierarchy. At the top sat the capo, the boss, whose word was absolute law and who received a cut of every single dollar, lira, or crop generated within his territory. Beneath him was the underboss, who managed day-to-day operations and acted as a buffer to insulate the boss from criminal liability. Beneath the underboss were the caporgimes, the captains who commanded crews of soldatos or soldiers. At the very bottom were the associates, men who worked with the mafia but could never be officially initiated, either because they were not of pure Italian descent or because they had not yet committed a contract murder to prove their loyalty. On the evening of February 1, 1893, the true, terrifying extent of the mafia's political infiltration was exposed to the world in a brutal incident that came to be known as the Notarbartolo murder. It was the day organized crime officially decapitated a high-ranking representative of the Italian establishment. Emanuele Notarbartolo was an aristocratic, deeply principled man of impeccable integrity. He had served as the mayor of Palermo and was later appointed as the Director General of the Bank of Sicily, the island's primary financial institution. During his tenure at the bank, Notarbartolo made an alarming discovery. The bank's massive capital reserves were being systematically raided by corrupt politicians, wealthy landowners, and top-tier mafia bosses. Millions of liras were being funneled into fraudulent agricultural loans and phantom investments that were never intended to be repaid. The chief architect of this corruption was a powerful, highly influential member of the Italian parliament named Raffaele Palizzolo. Palizzolo was a man who walked through Palermo like a king, using his political influence in Rome to secure government contracts for his mafia clients, and using the mafia's street-level muscle to violently intimidate voters during elections to ensure his perpetual re-election. When Notarbartolo attempted to launch an internal forensic audit to expose this massive web of corruption, the political machine in Rome fired him from his post at the bank, replacing him with a more compliant director. However, by late 1892, the Bank of Sicily was on the verge of complete collapse due to the endless skimming. Rumors began to circulate through the halls of power that the central government, desperate to avert a financial panic, was preparing to reappoint the incorruptible Notarbartolo to clean up the bank and prosecute the looters. The corrupt network panicked. If Notarbartolo regained control of the ledgers, dozens of politicians and bosses would face lifetime prison sentences. The order for his execution was given. On February 1, 1893, the 59-year-old Notarbartolo boarded a train from Termini Imerese back to Palermo. It was a dark, stormy night, and the train rattled slowly along the desolate northern coastline of the island. As the locomotive entered a completely isolated stretch of countryside near the town of Trabia, two men slipped out of the shadows of the train's corridor and quietly opened the door to Notarbartolo's private, first-class compartment. They were low-level mafia enforcers, hired specifically for their cold-blooded efficiency. The assassins drew long, heavy daggers. Notarbartolo, despite his age, fought back with desperate fury, using his cane to deflect the initial blows. But in the cramped, bouncing train compartment, he stood no chance. The men overwhelmed him, stabbing him 27 times across his chest, neck, and face. Once the old man lay dead on the floor, the killers lifted his mutilated corpse, opened the heavy carriage door against the howling wind, and threw his body out of the moving train onto the rocky tracks below. The discovery of Notarbartolo's body sent a shockwave through the entire nation of Italy. It was the very first time the mafia had dared to assassinate a figure of such immense social and political stature. What followed was a historical masterclass in judicial corruption. For 7 years, the investigation into the murder was systematically derailed. Police files mysteriously vanished from locked government cabinets. Evidence was contaminated. Potential witnesses who had seen suspicious activity at the train stations suddenly fled the country or died under mysterious circumstances. The corruption was so profound that Notarbartolo's son, Leopoldo, a young naval officer, realized he could never get justice within the borders of Sicily. He launched a relentless one-man public relations campaign, leveraging his family's noble connections to force the Italian parliament to move the murder trial completely out of Sicily to the northern city of Milan, far away from the immediate atmosphere of mafia intimidation. In 1902, the trial in Milan became a national sensation. For the first time, a train conductor broke down on the witness stand and confessed that he had witnessed the Member of Parliament, Raphael Palizzolo, meeting with the two known mafia assassins just hours before the train departed on that fateful night. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and Palizzolo was sentenced to 30 years in prison for orchestrating the execution. But the victory of the rule of law was brief. In 1904, the Supreme Court in Rome, highly vulnerable to backroom political pressure, overturned the entire verdict on a minute technicality, claiming that a single witness had been sworn into court using the wrong legal phrasing. A second trial was ordered, this time held in the city of Florence. The passage of time and an aggressive, expensive legal defense funded by Palizzolo's wealthy allies wore down the prosecution. Witnesses recanted their testimonies, claiming they had been confused or coerced by the police. The jury acquitted Palizzolo and his enforcers of all charges. When Raphael Palizzolo returned to Sicily, his ship was met at the Palermo docks by a massive, cheering crowd of thousands of people, a brass band playing triumphal music, and a procession of carriage drivers who carried him through the streets like a conquering hero. The historical lesson of the Notarbartolo murder was carved into the consciousness of every Sicilian. The mafia was officially more powerful than the laws of the United Kingdom of Italy. As the 20th century dawned, the systemic corruption, crushing agricultural poverty, and malaria epidemics made life in southern Italy completely unsustainable for millions of people. Between 1880 and 1920, a massive human exodus occurred. Over 4 million Italian immigrants packed their meager belongings into cardboard suitcases and boarded steamships bound across the Atlantic Ocean for the United States of America. The vast majority of these immigrants were honest, illiterate, deeply hard-working peasants, laborers, and craftsmen who dreamed of a life of dignified work. They arrived at Ellis Island and migrated directly into the crowded, dense urban tenements of New York's Lower East Side, neighborhoods like Mulberry Street and Elizabeth Street that quickly became known as Little Italy. Similar enclaves exploded in Brooklyn, Chicago, and the French Quarter of New Orleans. But hiding within this massive wave of honest, vulnerable humanity were elements of the Sicilian Mafia and the Neapolitan Camorra. These criminals looked at the sprawling, chaotic immigrant ghettos of America and saw an ideal, unregulated market. They realized that millions of their own countrymen were completely isolated by language barriers, deeply terrified of the Native American police who treated them with open racism, and culturally conditioned by centuries of Omerta never to seek the help of the government. By the early 1900s, an epidemic of urban terrorism terrorized the streets of Little Italy under a name that struck absolute terror into the hearts of every shopkeeper: La Mano Nera, the Black Hand. Contrary to popular belief and Hollywood mythology, the Black Hand was not a singular, unified secret society, nor was it the official name of the mafia. It was a highly effective, decentralized method of extortion used by independent street gangs, opportunistic thugs, and initiated mafiosi alike. The operational pattern of a Black Hand racket was simple and devastating. A criminal crew would identify a successful Italian immigrant who had managed to achieve a piece of the American dream: a butcher, a bakery owner, a successful grocer, or a wealthy saloon keeper. The victim would receive a crudely written letter in Italian or a local regional dialect. The letter would politely but firmly demand that a specific sum of cash, usually ranging from $500 to $2,000, a fortune at the time, be dropped off at a specific street corner, alleyway, or vacant lot at midnight. At the bottom of the letter, instead of a signature, the extortionists would draw a series of ominous symbols: a dagger piercing a bleeding heart, a skull and crossbones, or a hand dipped in thick black ink. If the hard-working business owner chose to ignore the letter or attempted to contact the New York City Police Department, the retaliation was swift, violent, and public. First came a final warning, often in the form of a pet poisoned or a brick thrown through a glass window. If compliance was still not met, the extortionists would plant a crude pipe bomb filled with black powder and iron nails on the doorstep of the business, detonating it in the middle of the night to blow the storefront to pieces. In extreme cases, the business owner's children would be snatched off the crowded streets on their way to school, held for ransom, or found dead in a tenement basement. The American authorities were completely blind to this underworld. The average New York police officer spoke only English, knew absolutely nothing about Sicilian cultural dynamics, and could not differentiate between an honest immigrant and a predator. Little Italy was a lawless island within Manhattan, completely at the mercy of the predators. The desperate battle to save the immigrant community from the clutches of the Black Hand centers around a singular, historic figure, Detective Joseph Petrosino. Born in Padula, Italy, Petrosino emigrated to New York as a young boy, shining shoes and working as a street sweeper before joining the New York City Police Department in 1883. He was a short, powerfully built man with broad shoulders, a thick neck, and a fierce, commanding presence. He was also a visionary law enforcement officer. He recognized that you could not defeat an insular, culturally sophisticated criminal network using standard American police tactics. Petrosino argued to his superiors that to break the Black Hand, the police had to speak the language, understand the regional dialects, and master the cultural psychological nuances of the community. In 1905, New York City authorities granted Petrosino the authority to form a highly specialized, top-secret unit known as the Italian Squad. Petrosino handpicked a small group of fluent, Italian-speaking detectives. He threw out the standard police uniforms and introduced deep undercover tactics. Petrosino and his men disguised themselves as illiterate ditch diggers, Italian priests, blind beggars, and sanitation workers, blending seamlessly into the crowded tenements of Mulberry Street. They intercepted extortion letters, laid elaborate midnight ambushes at designated cash drop locations, and dismantled secret bomb-making safe houses where the Black Hand manufactured their pipe bombs. Petrosino also pioneered the use of the dossier system, creating the first comprehensive intelligence database of known Italian criminals in America, mapping out their aliases, birthplaces, and criminal records across Europe. Petrosino recognized that the low-level thugs printing Black Hand letters were just the symptoms of a larger, deadlier disease. The real power behind the scenes was being orchestrated by high-level Sicilian mafiosi who were using the extortion profits to fund legitimate business fronts, such as olive oil import companies and funeral homes. The most powerful of these bosses was a man named Don Vito Cascioferro, the undisputed godfather of the Sicilian Mafia who had temporarily fled to America to evade arrest in Italy. Don Vito was an elegant, terrifying figure who wore impeccable three-piece suits, carried an expensive gold watch chain, and possessed deep ties to the political structure of Palermo. Petrosino realized that the most effective weapon against these international criminals was not a standard criminal trial, which could be easily sabotaged by witness intimidation, but deportation law, under the American immigration statutes of the era. An immigrant could be legally deported if it could be proven that they had lied about a previous criminal conviction in their home country when entering the United States. In February 1909, Joseph Petrosino embarked on a highly classified, high-risk mission. He traveled completely alone across the Atlantic Ocean to Palermo, Sicily. His objective was to personally meet with Italian judicial officials, access their confidential archives, and secure the certified physical criminal records of over 80 top-tier Italian mobsters currently operating in New York. Armed with these documents, Petrosino could legally launch a massive sweep, deporting the entire leadership structure of the American underworld in a single blow. But Petrosino underestimated the reach and speed of the network he was fighting. The news of his secret mission was leaked to the New York newspapers by a careless politician, and the article was immediately telegraphed to the mafia clans in Palermo. On the cold, dark night of March 12, 1909, Detective Joseph Petrosino was walking through the Piazza Marina in the heart of Palermo. He had been told by an intermediary that a high-level informant was waiting to meet him near the shadows of the square's historic Garibaldi garden to hand over critical files. Petrosino stood alone near the iron railings of the park, his hands tucked inside his heavy overcoat against the Mediterranean wind. He did not notice two figures stepping quietly out of the shadows behind him. The gunmen drew heavy-caliber revolvers. Before Petrosino could turn or draw his service weapon, a shot rang out, hitting him square in the back of the neck. As he stumbled forward onto the cobblestones, 3 more shots were fired into his face and head. The first great champion of Italian-American law enforcement lay dead in the dirt, killed in the shadow of the ancient roots of the trees of Piazza Marina. The man who ordered, and by historical accounts personally executed, the assassination was Don Vito Cascioferro. Though arrested days later by a furious Italian police force, Don Vito casually provided a rock-solid, unassailable alibi. A corrupt member of the Italian parliament swore under oath that Don Vito had been dining at his private estate miles away at the exact minute the shots were fired. Don Vito walked out of the police station a free man, his reputation as an untouchable god among men permanently cemented. Petrosino's body was returned to New York, where over 200,000 citizens of all ethnicities lined the streets for his funeral procession, the largest public funeral in the history of the city at that time. His tragic death proved a profound, dark reality. The Atlantic Ocean was absolutely no barrier for Cosa Nostra. The parent organization in the ancient groves of Sicily and the newborn criminal cells in the crowded streets of Manhattan were part of a single, living, breathing global empire. The foundations had been laid, the blood had been spilled, and the stage was now set for the explosive transformation of the 20s. In the next part of this complete historical documentary chronicle, the story crosses into the Roaring Twenties. The script will cover the onset of American Prohibition, which handed a multi-billion-dollar liquor monopoly to urban street gangs. It will follow Benito Mussolini's rise to power in Italy and his declaration of a brutal, total war against the Sicilian Mafia using the terrifying, lawless methods of the Iron Prefect, Sangiorgi. It will then document the bloody Castellammarese War in New York City, where a young visionary named Lucky Luciano wiped out the old world bosses to establish the corporate-style commission and the infamous 5 families. The death of Detective Joseph Petrosino proved that the Atlantic Ocean was no barrier for Cosa Nostra, but as the world entered the 1920s, a dual cataclysm erupted on both sides of the ocean that would permanently alter the destiny of organized crime. In Italy, a totalitarian dictator rose to power and launched a ruthless campaign to totally exterminate the mafia in its homeland. Simultaneously, in the United States, a massive political experiment handed the American underworld the keys to a multi-billion-dollar empire. The story now splits between the blood-soaked hills of Sicily and the machine-gun-riddled streets of New York and Chicago. In October 1922, Benito Mussolini and his National Fascist Party marched on Rome, seizing absolute control of the Italian government. Mussolini was a megalomaniac dictator who envisioned a totalitarian corporate state where nothing existed outside the control of the government. A totalitarian ruler cannot tolerate a state within a state. He could not permit a shadow government like Cosa Nostra to collect taxes through extortion, run its own courts of honor, and control the political voting blocks of Sicily. In 1924, Mussolini made his first official state visit to Sicily. He arrived in the small town of Piana dei Greci, where the local mayor was a legendary, old-school mafia boss named Don Ciccio Cuccia. Don Ciccio was a man deeply secure in his own local power. When he saw Mussolini arriving with a massive escort of dozens of armed police officers and state vehicles, the mafia boss leaned over to the dictator and whispered loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "Why do you need all these police? You are with me. You are under my protection." Mussolini was deeply insulted by the comment. He flatly rejected the boss's protection. In retaliation, Don Ciccio ordered the townspeople to completely empty the central square. When Mussolini stepped up onto the balcony to deliver a grand fascist speech, he found himself looking out at a completely deserted courtyard, with only a few stray dogs and a handful of mocking local mafiosi leaning against the walls. It was a direct, public humiliation of the dictator. Mussolini returned to Rome filled with a cold, vengeful fury. He realized that if fascism was to totally conquer Sicily, the mafia had to be completely broken. To execute this domestic war, Mussolini selected a man named Cesare Mori, appointing him as the prefect of Palermo with absolute, unrestricted emergency powers. Mori was known to history as the Iron Prefect. He was a stern, humorless, and fiercely incorruptible law enforcement veteran who viewed the mafia not as a romantic society of honor, but as a cancerous disease of backwardness and criminality. Mori arrived in Sicily in October 1925, and he did not use standard judicial methods. He did not wait for warrants, he did not worry about civil liberties, and he did not care about the rule of law. He used the brutal, overwhelming tactics of an occupying military army. The Iron Prefect recognized that the power of a mafia boss relied entirely on his public prestige and the illusion of his absolute invulnerability. Mori sought to shatter that illusion through public humiliation and terror. He targeted the town of Gangi, a notorious, heavily fortified inland mountain stronghold of several powerful criminal clans. In January 1926, Mori surrounded the entire town of Gangi with thousands of heavily armed carabinieri police and fascist militia. He cut the telegraph lines, blocked all the roads, and completely isolated the town from the outside world. His men then moved door to door, rounding up the wives, children, and elderly parents of the suspected mafiosi who had fled into the surrounding hills. Mori held the families hostage in public buildings. He ordered his men to slaughter the mobsters' cattle, poison their private water wells, and requisition their properties. Mori sent an ultimatum into the mountains. If the mafiosi did not surrender, their families would be deported, their homes would be leveled with dynamite, and their children would be scattered into state orphanages. The psychological strategy worked perfectly. To a Sicilian man of honor, his public reputation was everything. Seeing their wives dragged through the mud and their properties destroyed broke their resolve. Dozens of hardened fugitives walked down from the hills with their hands up, weeping in front of their neighbors. Mori repeated these siege tactics across the entire island. He arrested over 11,000 people over a 4-year period. He used systematic torture, including beatings, waterboarding, and electrical shocks, to extract confessions and force low-level associates to name their superiors. He arrested corrupt aristocrats, mayors, and judges who had protected the mafia for decades. Even the legendary Don Vito Cascioferro, the man who had orchestrated the murder of Joseph Petrosino, was swept up in Mori's net. Don Vito was convicted of an old, long-forgotten murder and sentenced to life in prison, where he would eventually die in a desolate cell during an Allied bombing raid in World War II. By 1929, Mussolini proudly declared to the world that fascism had totally eradicated the mafia. On the surface, it appeared true. The protection rackets had ceased, the rural highways were safe for travel, and the clans had vanished from public life. But Mori's campaign was a structural cure. It was merely a violent suppression of the symptoms. He did not solve the deep agricultural poverty, the lack of education, or the economic isolation of Sicily that had birthed the mafia in the first place. Furthermore, Mori's brutal dragnet caused a massive underground migration. To escape the fascist firing squads and the penal islands, hundreds of initiated, highly experienced Sicilian mafiosi fled the country. They boarded cargo ships, forged passports, and slipped across the borders. A few went to South America, but the vast majority crossed the Atlantic, heading directly toward the rapidly expanding immigrant communities of New York, Chicago, and Detroit. They arrived in America traumatized by Mori's violence, deeply hardened, and ready to rebuild their networks. They brought with them the exact operational structures, blood rituals, and ruthless discipline of the old country, landing right into a land of infinite wealth. While the Iron Prefect was starving the mafia out of Sicily, the United States government inadvertently handed the criminal underworld the greatest economic gift in human history. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, legally banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors across the nation. Prohibition had begun. The lawmakers who passed Prohibition genuinely believed it would moralize the country, reduce domestic violence, and empty the prisons. Instead, they took a massive, deeply ingrained consumer habit enjoyed by tens of millions of citizens and converted it into a completely illegal, unregulated, untaxed, multi-billion-dollar black market monopoly. Everyday citizens did not stop drinking alcohol. They simply stopped buying it from legitimate, tax-paying businesses. Overnight, thousands of hidden, illegal drinking dens known as speakeasies exploded across every American city. To supply these speakeasies with beer, whiskey, and wine, an immense international supply chain had to be constructed. Rum had to be smuggled on boats from the Caribbean, whiskey had to be driven across the Canadian border, and massive secret industrial breweries had to be operated inside urban warehouses. Before Prohibition, the street gangs of Little Italy were small-time predators. They ran low-level gambling rings, pickpocket networks, and neighborhood black-hand extortion rackets. They fought over pennies. Prohibition changed the scale of crime forever. It turned street thugs into corporate executives of violence. It provided them with rivers of untaxed cash that allowed them to buy fleets of delivery trucks, hire private armies of gunmen, and systematically bribe entire city police departments, mayors, judges, and federal agents. In New York City, the criminal underworld quickly divided along generational and cultural lines. The established, dominant rulers of the Italian gangs were known as the Mustache Petes. These were older mobsters who had been initiated in the rural villages of Sicily before migrating to America. They were deeply conservative, insular, and stuck in the traditions of the old world. The Mustache Petes spoke very little English, lived exclusively within the boundaries of Little Italy, and refused to do business with anyone who was not a pure-blooded Sicilian. They viewed criminal operations through the lens of ancient village feuds. They made their money by brutally exploiting their own immigrant neighbors through low-level extortion, and they looked down on other ethnic criminal groups, such as the powerful Irish and Jewish bootleggers, refusing to form alliances with them. By the late 1920s, the entire New York underworld was dominated by two autocratic Mustache Petes who despised each other. The first was Joe Masseria, known to the public as Joe the Boss. Masseria was a short, heavily overweight man with a gluttonous appetite and a reputation for extreme, unpredictable violence. He ruled his territory from his headquarters in Manhattan's Lower East Side, demanding absolute, blind obedience from his subordinates. The second was Salvatore Maranzano, a highly educated, sophisticated man who had arrived from Sicily in the mid-1920s, sent specifically by powerful old-world bosses to organize the American operations. Maranzano settled in Brooklyn. He spoke fluent Latin, studied ancient military history, and was deeply obsessed with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, seeking to organize his criminal crews like Roman legions. Beneath these two old-world dictators, a new generation of young Italian-American gangsters was growing increasingly frustrated. This younger faction was led by a brilliant, cold-blooded visionary named Salvatore Luciano, known to history as Lucky Luciano. Born in La Cara Friddi, Sicily, Luciano had moved to New York as a young child. He grew up on the multi-ethnic streets of the Lower East Side, and he did not care about ancient Sicilian village honors or regional blood feuds. He cared strictly about profit and efficiency. Luciano looked at the Mustache Petes and saw dinosaurs who were ruining business. While Masseria and Maranzano were wasting millions of dollars fighting bloody turf wars over ethnic pride, Luciano was busy building secret, highly profitable business alliances with brilliant non-Italian gangsters. His closest childhood friend and criminal partner was Meyer Lansky, a Jewish financial genius who understood how to launder money through offshore banks and legitimate corporations. Luciano also partnered with Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a fearless Jewish enforcer, and Frank Costello, a master political fixer who controlled the politicians of Tammany Hall. Luciano and his contemporaries, who included future bosses like Carlo Gambino, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese, called themselves the Young Turks. They recognized that the future of organized crime in America required a corporate structure. Crime needed to be run like a modern business syndicate, with territorial boundaries, shared distribution networks, and peaceful arbitration. But before Luciano could build his criminal utopia, The old-world hatreds of the mustache Petes erupted into a total war that brought the underworld to its knees. In 1930, the tension between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano exploded into the Castellammarese War, named after the Sicilian town of Castellammarese del Golfo, which was Maranzano's ancestral home. For over a year, the streets of New York City became a free-fire military zone. Gunmen from both sides ambushed each other in broad daylight, outside restaurants, inside barber shops, and on crowded tenement sidewalks. Dozens of gangsters were slaughtered, bootlegging shipments were routinely hijacked, and the constant public violence forced the police and federal authorities to launch massive crackdowns, freezing the distribution of alcohol and strangling the profits of the Young Turks. Lucky Luciano, who was officially serving as Joe Masseria's top underboss, realized that the Castellammarese War was an economic disaster. He saw that whichever side won, the old-school mentality would continue to rule, and the younger generation would remain trapped as soldiers in an endless, meaningless feud. Luciano decided to secretly contact Salvatore Maranzano, the rival boss, through his partner Meyer Lansky. Luciano made a cold, calculated business proposition. He would arrange the assassination of his own boss, Joe Masseria, effectively ending the war if Maranzano guaranteed to stop the killing, recognize the territories of the younger crews, and create a peaceful status quo. Maranzano greedily accepted the deal. On April 15, 1931, Lucky Luciano invited Joe Masseria to a prolonged, lavish lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a seafood restaurant located on the boardwalk of Coney Island. It was a quiet, sunny afternoon. The two men ate heavily, drank expensive wine, and played cards for hours in the back room of the empty restaurant. Late in the afternoon, Luciano stood up from the card table and excused himself to go to the restroom. The moment the bathroom door clicked shut, the front door of the restaurant burst open. 4 heavily armed hitmen stepped into the dining room. The hit team consisted of Luciano's closest enforcers, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. Joe Masseria turned in his chair, but before he could reach for his firearm, the 4 men opened fire at point-blank range. Over 20 bullets tore through the restaurant, shattering glasses and hitting Masseria squarely in the back and head. Joe the boss collapsed dead onto the floor, clutching an ace of diamonds in his bloody hand. Luciano stepped out of the bathroom, casually washed his hands, and left the restaurant before the police arrived. The reign of Joe Masseria was over. With Masseria out of the way, Salvatore Maranzano declared himself the victor of the war. In May 1931, Maranzano called a historic summit of over 500 Italian mobsters at a massive banquet hall in the Bronx. He sought to bring order to the chaos, but he did so by imposing his own old-world imperial ambitions. Maranzano officially divided the Italian underworld of New York into 5 distinct criminal families, each led by a designated boss. He established a strict corporate hierarchy that remains the blueprint of the mafia to this day: boss, underboss, consigliere, capogime, and soldier. But then Maranzano made a fatal mistake. He stood up before the assembly, drew upon his obsession with the Roman Empire, and declared himself to be the capo di tutti I capi, the boss of all bosses. He demanded that every family in the country pay him a regular monthly tribute, and he stated that no major decision could be made anywhere in America without his personal permission. Lucky Luciano and the Young Turks sat in the audience, smiling and nodding their heads in agreement, but internally they knew that Maranzano had just signed his own death warrant. They had not killed one dictator just to replace him with another who was even more arrogant. Maranzano, deeply paranoid, also realized that Luciano was far too powerful to control. He secretly hired an independent Irish gunman named Vincent Mad Dog Cole to assassinate Luciano and Vito Genovese, scheduling a meeting at his Manhattan office to finalize the hit contract. But Mayor Lansky's vast network of street informants discovered the plot before the hitman could move. Luciano acted with surgical precision. He knew that if he used Italian gunmen to hit Maranzano, it would trigger another generational blood war among the 5 families. He turned to Lansky, who assembled a team of 4 Jewish hitmen from the Lower East Side. On September 10, 1931, the four Jewish hitmen entered Maranzano's grand office on the ninth floor of the New York Central Building on Park Avenue. They were dressed in immaculate tailored suits and carried forged police badges, posing as federal tax agents conducting a surprise raid. Maranzano's bodyguards, completely fooled by the disguises, stepped away from the door and allowed the men to enter the inner office. Once inside, the men drew silenced pistols and long daggers. They pinned the 45-year-old Maranzano to his desk. When he attempted to fight back, they stabbed him multiple times in the chest and throat to silence his screams, before finishing him with 4 gunshots to the head. The hitmen ran down the stairs, blending into the Manhattan crowds, just as Mad Dog Cole was walking into the building to collect his cash advance for the hit on Luciano. The era of the mustache Pete's was officially dead and buried. With the old-world dictators eliminated, 33-year-old Lucky Luciano became the most powerful criminal mind in the world, but he resolutely refused to take the title of boss of all bosses. He recognized that absolute power held by a single man invited jealousy, betrayal, and federal law enforcement scrutiny. Instead, Luciano revolutionized organized crime by introducing a democratic, corporate system of governance. He created the Commission. The Commission was designed as a corporate board of directors for the National Crime Syndicate. It originally consisted of the bosses of the newly designated 5 families of New York, along with Al Capone representing the Chicago outfit and Magaddino representing the Buffalo family. Later, bosses from Philadelphia, Detroit, and Boston were granted seats. The National Commission, the Board of Directors, settled disputes / avoid war, GNOVSC family, GMBNO family, LUCCHESC family, Lucky Luciano, Vincent Mangano, Tommaso Gagliano, BONANNO family, Colombo family, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Prophesy. The rules of the commission were absolute. No single boss was superior to another. Every member possessed an equal vote on the board. The commission met secretly in hotel suites, luxury estates, and hunting lodges across the country to peacefully arbitrate territorial disputes, divide bootlegging and gambling revenues, and regulate the underworld economy. Crucially, Luciano established that no mafia family could execute a boss or a senior initiated member without the explicit, unanimous authorization of the commission. Violence was no longer driven by personal vendettas. It was a regulated corporate tool used strictly to protect the bottom line. The 5 New York families were structured to ensure stability and insulate the leadership from prosecution. The first family was led by Luciano himself, which would later become the Genovese family. The second was led by Vincent Mangano, later known as the Gambino family. The third was commanded by Tommaso Gagliano, later the Lucchese family. The fourth was controlled by Joseph Prophesy, later the Colombo family. The fifth was led by Joseph Bonanno, the Bonanno family. By the end of 1931, the American Mafia had evolved from a disorganized collection of immigrant street gangs into a highly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar corporate empire that controlled the labor unions, the waterfront docks, the gambling networks, and the political machinery of the United States. They had survived the brutality of the Iron Prefect in Sicily, crossed the ocean, conquered Prohibition, and built a modern syndicate that would dominate the American landscape for the next 50 years. This historical documentary chronicle will continue in the next phase. The narrative will detail the golden era of the mob, exploring the secret pact between Lucky Luciano and the United States Navy during World War II, the transformation of the Nevada desert into the multi-billion-dollar gambling mecca of Las Vegas, the catastrophic exposure of the syndicate at the Appalachian Meeting of 1957, and the eventual collapse of the Code of Silence during the historic televised Senate hearings. The creation of the Commission in 1931 stabilized the American underworld, transforming a collection of warring street gangs into a highly disciplined, multi-billion-dollar corporate syndicate. As the United States moved out of Prohibition and into the crucible of the mid-20th century, the Mafia entered its golden era. The organization expanded its reach far beyond bootlegging, infiltrating the highest levels of the American military, the labor movement, and the political establishment, before building an entirely new empire out of the desert sands of Nevada. The first major test of this newly corporatized syndicate came with the outbreak of World War II. In 1942, the United States military faced a silent crisis on its home front. French luxury liner SS Normandy, which was being converted into a massive troop transport ship for the U.S. Navy, caught fire and capsized at its pier on the west side of Manhattan. The government deeply feared that German saboteurs and Nazi spies had infiltrated the New York waterfront docks. The Office of Naval Intelligence realized that the United States government had completely lost control of its own ports. The docks, the longshoremen, and the trucking unions were entirely dominated by the Mafia, specifically by Albert Anastasia and the crews of the family officially led by Lucky Luciano. The problem for the government was that Luciano was currently serving a 30 to 50-year sentence at the maximum security Great Meadow Correctional Facility, having been convicted in 1936 by a relentless special prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Desperate to secure the ports, naval intelligence officers approached a high-ranking political fixer and mafia associate named Moses Polikoff, who in turn contacted Mayor Lansky. Lansky served as the bridge. He traveled to the state prison to meet with Luciano, offering a cold business proposition from the United States military. If Luciano used his absolute authority over the New York docks to guarantee complete waterfront security and prevent any further sabotage, the state would actively reconsider his prison sentence once the war concluded. Luciano accepted the deal. Within days of the prison meeting, an invisible order rippled through the New York harbor. Suspicious characters were quietly removed from the docks. Longshoremen became the eyes and ears of the military, reporting every unusual movement to naval intelligence. Not a single incident of sabotage occurred on the New York waterfront for the remainder of the war. The cooperation went even deeper during the 1943 Allied invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky. The U.S. military needed precise, actionable intelligence regarding the coastal defenses, topography, and local power structures of Sicily. From his prison cell, Luciano utilized his old-world connections, providing the military with maps, names of trusted local contacts, and introductions to powerful Sicilian mafia clans that had been driven underground by Cesare Mori. When American troops landed on the beaches of Sicily, they were met not with fierce local resistance, but with local mafiosi who guided them through the mountain passes and helped dismantle the remaining fascist holdouts. In exchange for this wartime service, Governor Thomas E. Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence in 1946 on the strict condition that he be permanently deported to Italy, never to set foot on American soil again. While Luciano was adjusting to exile in Europe, his contemporary partners in America were looking toward the western frontier. In the late 1940s, the state of Nevada was a vast, desolate desert, but it possessed one unique legal attribute: gambling was entirely legal. A visionary, psychopathic Gambino family enforcer named Benjamin Bugsy Siegel looked at the dusty town of Las Vegas and saw a gold mine. Siegel realized that instead of running illegal backroom craps games in crowded New York tenements, where police required constant bribery, the mafia could build grand, legal luxury casino resorts where the wealthy would willingly hand over their life savings. Using millions of dollars borrowed directly from the Teamsters Union Pension Fund, a massive financial reservoir completely controlled by the mob through corrupt union officials, Siegel constructed the Flamingo Hotel and Casino, opening its doors in December 1946. It was the first mega-resort of the modern Las Vegas Strip, but Siegel was a brilliant killer, not a skilled corporate accountant. The construction costs skyrocketed due to mismanagement and rampant skimming by Siegel's girlfriend, Virginia Hill. In 1947, the top bosses of the commission, including Mayor Lansky and Charles Luciano, convened a secret summit at the Hotel Nacional in Havana, Cuba. They reviewed the financial ledgers of the Flamingo and realized that Siegel had stolen from his own partners. On the night of June 20, 1947, as Siegel sat reading a newspaper in the living room of his Beverly Hills home, a hitman fired multiple rounds through the window with a military carbine rifle, killing him instantly. Within minutes of the execution, mafia representatives walked into the Flamingo in Las Vegas, casually announcing that new management was taking control. The execution of Bugsy Siegel did not halt the Las Vegas project, it accelerated it. Throughout the 1950s, the Commission systematically built a neon empire in the desert, constructing legendary casinos like the Sands, the Sahara, the Riviera, and the Stardust. The operational mechanism of the Las Vegas racket was a masterclass in financial sophistication known as the skim. Every night before the casino revenues were counted, recorded in the official ledgers, and taxed by the federal government, trusted mafia employees would enter a high-security back room called the counting room. These men would physically stuff hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash directly into leather suitcases. This unrecorded, untaxed cash was then driven across state lines to the bosses of the 5 families in New York, the Chicago outfit, and families in Kansas City and Detroit. Las Vegas became a money machine that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually, funding the expansion of the mob into legitimate real estate, banking, and political campaigns. For decades, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, maintained an official public stance that a nationwide, organized Italian criminal syndicate did not exist. Hoover publicly claimed that American crime was merely a collection of isolated, independent street gangs. He focused the entire resources of the FBI on bank robbers, communists, and civil rights activists, leaving the mafia completely free to grow its empire. That massive deception collapsed entirely on November 14, 1957, due to a small-town police sergeant named Edgar Croswell. Croswell was a sharp, observant state trooper in the rural village of Appalachian, New York. He noticed that a wealthy local businessman and mafia associate named Joseph Barbera was making massive arrangements at his isolated 53-acre hilltop estate. Barbera had reserved dozens of rooms at local motels and ordered immense quantities of expensive steaks and liquors. On November 14, Croswell drove up the winding dirt road toward the Barbera estate. He was stunned to find the driveway packed with over 60 luxury Cadillacs and Lincolns, all bearing out-of-state license plates. Inside the house, the supreme leadership of the American Mafia was currently holding a highly classified National Commission summit to discuss the recent assassination of Gambino boss Albert Anastasia and the division of the narcotics trade. Trooper Croswell quietly backed down the driveway and established a massive police roadblock at the base of the hill, calling for backup from the New York State Police. When the mob bosses inside the house spotted the police uniforms through the windows, absolute panic erupted. Heavily overweight men wearing $3,000 tailored silk suits and expensive Italian leather shoes threw open the back doors and fled blindly into the dense, muddy woods and briar patches of rural New York. The police arrested over 60 top-tier mafia bosses that afternoon as they stumbled out of the forest, covered in mud and burrs. The detainees included Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, and Paul Castellano. The Appalachian meeting was a catastrophic public relations disaster for the syndicate. J. Edgar Hoover could no longer maintain his public lie. The very next day, Hoover created the Top Hoodlum program, ordering every FBI field office in the country to dedicate its full resources to wiretapping, tracking, and dismantling the hidden architecture of Cosa Nostra. The public exposure deepened in September 1963 when the ultimate code of the mafia, Omerta, was shattered on national television before millions of American citizens. Joseph Valachi, a low-level, deeply traumatized soldier in the Genovese family, found himself imprisoned at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The paranoid boss of the family, Vito Genovese, was also imprisoned in the same facility. Genovese mistakenly believed that Valachi was cooperating with the government, and he gave Valachi the infamous kiss of death in the prison yard, a traditional warning that an execution had been formally authorized. Terrified for his life and realizing the family had abandoned him, Valachi chose to do the unthinkable. He became a federal informant. In September 1963, Valachi stepped before a congressional committee led by Senator John L. McClellan. With a raspy voice, he laid bare the inner universe of the organization. He revealed that the syndicate did not call itself the Mafia. Its real, ancient name was Cosa Nostra. Valachi drew detailed structural diagrams of the 5 families on a blackboard, explaining the exact roles of the boss, the underboss, and the capo. He described the blood initiation ritual, the corporate rules of the commission, and named hundreds of active members who were hiding behind legitimate business fronts. For the first time in history, the American public saw that the shadow empire was real, documented, and vulnerable. Armed with Valachi's structural maps, the United States Department of Justice spent the late 1960s searching for a legal tool that could permanently decapitate the syndicate. Standard criminal law was completely ineffective. If a low-level mafia soldier committed a murder or ran a gambling ring, only that soldier went to prison. The high-level bosses, who had ordered the crime from their luxury estates, remained entirely insulated from criminal liability because they never explicitly put their instructions in writing or participated in the physical execution of the acts. The legal breakthrough arrived in 1970 when Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, universally known as the RICO Act. RICO altered the entire landscape of American law enforcement. Under the RICO statutes, prosecutors no longer had to prove that a boss personally committed a specific crime. Instead, they only had to prove that the boss was the director of a continuous, ongoing criminal enterprise, a racket. If subordinates committed 2 or more acts of racketeering, such as extortion, gambling, or murder, within a 10-year period on behalf of the organization, the entire leadership structure could be prosecuted as a single entity. The boss could be sentenced to life in prison simply for holding the title of director of the enterprise. For over a decade, the FBI slowly and meticulously built massive RICO cases, utilizing newly legalized court-authorized electronic surveillance. They hid tiny microphones inside the dashboards of mafia vehicles, inside the social clubs of Little Italy, and beneath the dining tables of mob safehouses. By the mid-1980s, a young, intensely ambitious federal prosecutor in Manhattan named Rudolph Giuliani realized that the government finally possessed the evidence to launch the ultimate strike against the organization. Giuliani launched the historic Mafia Commission trial of 1985. Instead of prosecuting individual families separately, Giuliani put the actual board of directors of organized crime on trial simultaneously. The defendants included Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, the acting boss of the Genovese family, Carmine Jr. Persico, the boss of the Colombo family, and Anthony Tony Dux Corallo, the boss of the Lucchese family. The evidence presented in the courtroom was overwhelming. The prosecution played thousands of hours of high-quality federal wiretap recordings. The jurors listened to the literal voices of the bosses, casually discussing the execution of rival mobsters, dividing the multi-million-dollar concrete contracts for the construction of Manhattan skyscrapers, and deciding who sat on the commission. In November 1986, the jury returned guilty verdicts across every single count. The top bosses of New York were sentenced to consecutive terms of 100 years in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively dismantling the core leadership structure that Lucky Luciano had built 50 years prior. As the old, disciplined leadership went to prison for life, the Gambino family fell under the control of a man who would become the final, most famous celebrity mob boss in American history, John Gotti. In December 1985, Gotti had orchestrated the spectacular, unauthorized assassination of the reigning Gambino boss, Paul Castellano, outside Sparks Steak House in Midtown Manhattan. Castellano was gunned down in broad daylight during the evening rush hour, and Gotti watched the execution from a parked car across the street, immediately seizing the throne of the largest criminal family in America. John Gotti was the absolute antithesis of the traditional, secretive mafia boss. He despised the low profile kept by old-school leaders like Carlo Gambino. Gotti relished the public spotlight. He walked through the streets of New York wearing $2,000 Brioni silk suits, maintained an impeccably coiffed hairstyle, and regularly smiled for television cameras outside his Burgin Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. The news media dubbed him the Dapper Don. When he managed to secure acquittals in 3 successive federal trials by systematically bribing jurors and violently intimidating government witnesses, the press renamed him the Teflon Don, implying that no criminal charge could ever stick to him. But Gotti's immense vanity and public arrogance became his absolute undoing. The FBI became deeply obsessed with destroying him. They rented an apartment above the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, installing high-tech listening devices inside the building's hallway and a private apartment where Gotti held confidential meetings. The wiretaps captured Gotti's actual voice, engaged in rampant, egotistical rants. He was recorded explicitly admitting to authorizing multiple contract murders, complaining about the financial performance of his captains, and bitterly insulting his own loyal underboss, Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. In 1991, the FBI arrested Gotti and Gravano together. Inside the federal holding cells, prosecutors played the secret wiretap recordings for Gravano. Sammy the Bull realized that Gotti was preparing to use him as a legal sacrificial lamb to save himself from the death penalty. Deeply betrayed by his own boss, Gravano broke his sacred oath of Omerta and turned state's evidence. Sammy the Bull Gravano became the highest-ranking member of the American Mafia to ever testify in a court of law. In 1992, Gravano stepped onto the witness stand, calmly and meticulously detailing 19 contract murders that he had executed or authorized, explicitly linking John Gotti to every single directive. The Teflon Don's armor shattered completely. Gotti was convicted of racketeering and multiple counts of murder, receiving a sentence of life in prison without parole. He would eventually die of cancer in the bleak confines of the federal Supermax prison in Marion, Illinois, in 2002. The era of the celebrity mob boss who ruled over cities with complete public impunity was officially dead. While the American Mafia was collapsing under the weight of the RICO Act and internal betrayals, a parallel, far bloodier cataclysm was unfolding in the ancient homeland of Sicily. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a hyperviolent faction known as the Corleonesi, originating from the impoverished mountain town of Corleone, launched a hostile takeover of the Sicilian Mafia. The faction was led by a short, terrifyingly brutal man named Salvatore Toto Riina, known to his contemporaries as the Beast. Riina possessed absolutely none of the corporate diplomacy of Lucky Luciano. He believed in total, unmitigated terror. He launched the Second Mafia War, executing over 1,000 rival mobsters across Sicily. Riina then turned his weapons directly against the Italian state. His gunmen assassinated governors, police chiefs, and anti-mafia investigators in broad daylight. The resistance against Riina's reign of terror was spearheaded by 2 deeply courageous Sicilian prosecutors, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. Operating out of a reinforced bunker courtroom inside the walls of the Ucciardone prison in Palermo, Falcone and Borsellino organized the historic Maxi trial of 1986. Utilizing the testimony of Tommaso Buscetta, the first major Sicilian mafia boss to break the code of silence, the prosecutors managed to convict 338 mafiosi simultaneously, securing thousands of collective years of prison sentences. Toto Riina responded with a level of violence that shocked the entire civilized world. On May 23, 1992, as prosecutor Giovanni Falcone was driving from the Palermo airport with his wife and security detail, a massive explosion tore the landscape apart. Riina's enforcers had packed a drainage pipe beneath the A29 highway near the town of Capaci with over 1,000 pounds of military-grade explosives, detonating it via remote control. The blast completely obliterated the highway, leaving a massive crater and killing Falcone, his wife, and 3 police bodyguards instantly. Less than 2 months later, on July 19, Riina struck again, detonating a massive car bomb outside the apartment building of Falcone's close partner, Paolo Borsellino, killing the prosecutor and 5 police officers. The horrific assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino proved to be a fatal strategic miscalculation for Cosa Nostra. The public outrage across Italy reached an absolute boiling point. Millions of citizens flooded the streets of Palermo, weeping and demanding that the government destroy the criminals once and for all. The Italian government responded by declaring an absolute state of emergency, deploying over 7,000 heavily armed military soldiers to occupy Sicily. In January 1993, Italian special forces finally captured Toto Riina inside a nondescript villa in Palermo, where he had been hiding in plain sight for 23 years. Riina was placed under Italy's strict Article 41 bis prison regime, a system of absolute sensory deprivation and complete isolation designed explicitly to prevent a boss from communicating with the outside world. He spent the remainder of his life behind glass walls, dying in a prison hospital in 2017. The violent assault on the state had broken the back of the traditional Sicilian Cosa Nostra, reducing the once omnipotent organization to a fragmented, defensive shadow of its former self. Today, as the 21st century progresses, the Italian Mafia on both sides of the Atlantic is a fundamentally transformed entity. The era of the neighborhood godfather, who ruled over entire urban quarters through sheer physical terror, controlled the industrial labor unions, and skimmed millions of dollars from the counting rooms of Las Vegas, is completely gone. Constant 24-hour electronic surveillance, facial recognition software, global financial tracking networks, and a complete lack of loyalty among younger generations have rendered the traditional, insular structure obsolete. Yet Cosa Nostra has not entirely vanished. It has adapted to survive. The modern mafioso rarely carries a firearm or operates a crude protection racket on street corners. Instead, they have migrated into the quiet, invisible realms of white-collar crime. They operate through complex corporate networks, participating in international cyber fraud, medical insurance scams, green energy money laundering schemes, and sophisticated online gambling networks. They hide their profits within the global digital economy, utilizing offshore tax havens and shell companies. The violent blood rituals and ancient oaths of honor born in the lemon groves of 19th-century Sicily have largely been replaced by the sterile efficiency of a computer keyboard. But the fundamental motivation remains exactly the same as it was in 1861. The unquenchable pursuit of power, wealth, and exploitation at the expense of the rule of law. This concludes the complete, truthful, and chronological historical documentary chronicle of the Italian Mafia. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing,